Ready, guys? I'm just laughing about this. We have one replacement. We have Eleanor Price Leach. You actually do use Zach's name. Dr. Eleanor Price Leach, who is a great-great-great-grandchild of Ulysses and Julia. And the rest of us are great-great-grandchildren of Ulysses and Julia from two different lines. So the two Buck people, raise your hands. We have Miriam, known as Mim, and Julia. And then Eleanor. And then we have Nancy Griffith Price, Claire Ruffstow Pilecki, and John Griffiths. And we are all Freds. Oh, and I'm Ulysses. So we have, in fact, the only Julia and the only Ulysses in our generation. It's a big generation. We're the baby boomers of the Grant family. There are two generations below us now. We have some of them here, but I won't embarrass them unless they want to be embarrassed later. Anyway, I agreed to moderate a panel, which was just going to be sort of chit-chat, and as some of you, a bunch of you know me from the years, but so I'm recently retired as the chief curator at the Newark Museum, so public speaking is something I've done a lot over the years. I calculated, I wrote something, and I've done over 1,500 public lectures in the course of my career, so I'm used to being up here without notes. But I am not used to being up anywhere without pictures. And I started talking, and Rebecca said, oh, we're totally high-tech, we can do anything you want. And then Claire said, oh, I have pictures. And then Mim said, oh, I have pictures, and I've seen her pictures. And I said, so we thought we would sort of get the conversation rolling by showing pictures and trying to explain who we are and who's not here. So I stole this title from a movie that I liked. It was set in Hawaii. And the subtitle is, if I ever get to it, will be the title of my memoir, which is John Marszalek's idea, who said I should call it Growing Up Grant, because I am Ulysses Grant Dietz, but I was called Grant growing up. Because in the 1950s, not only did you not name your child Ulysses, but Ulysses S. Grant was at the bottom of his popularity in the history of the world. And my grandfather knew I would be tortured. And so I was called Grant, which was a good, safe name in the 50s and 60s. I didn't adopt using my first name until I was 15 in 1970, when it was cool to have a weird name. So there you go. So who are we? Who are these descendants? Now, I was joking at lunch that we all gather in a Gothic chapel in the Rocky Mountains every year, and we wear our hoods. And we worship an image of you, but we don't. The only time we have gotten together as a whole family is through organizations like this. Terry Miller in Galena, Tim Good in St. Louis, and John Marszalek and the sort of the legacy of John Simon here in Starkville. What, you're going to interrupt me already?
And also the Grant Monument Association, which brought everybody
Well,
together.
I hadn't gotten there yet. And the Grant Monument Association, which where's Frank? Which Frank, my cousin Claire and I referred to him as our son for years, because he resurrected the Grant Monument Association that went under when the tomb was given to the Park Service, and was resurrected by Frank to be an ongoing watchdog. And I still go to the tomb every year, except I didn't go this year, to give a little speech on his birthday in April. But these are the places that have brought the family together. And one of the reasons Starkville is the new sort of emotional epicenter of grantees. What do you call us? Grantees, that's not a good idea, but anyway. I don't want to take up too much of this because I can totally dominate because I'm loud. So here they are. This is like the marriage that defined the 19th century. And it does fall into my whole history as a curator. Because Julia and Ulysses are born in the 1820s on the frontier. They gradually rise in power accidentally, as you all know the story, until the war hits. They represent the whole movement of America, the industrial and economic and social changes in the 19th century, and they end up living in Manhattan at the epicenter of Gilded Age America, where everybody with money goes at least once or twice to establish a beachhead. And here they are late in life, not my favorite images of either of them, but this is who they became. They became the archetype of Gilded Age Americans, dancing the same dance as the rich and powerful, concentrated in the East, but coming from everywhere in the country. And here are the kids. So, Fred, who's my great-grandfather, and most of us are Freds. Buck, the Ulysses Jr., who shares with me a birthday and a high school. He and I are born on the same day, and we went to the same boarding school. Nellie, the apple of her father's eye, although he adored all of his children. He was a totally permissive parent, by the way. Nellie, and then Jessie, who was the baby, and was pampered as babies are. If you ever read books on birth order, and totally works for this family. And sort of one of the things I wanted to, and one of the things we may talk about as we grow up, and I know I've talked about this with Mim, looking through her family albums in San Diego, is that each of those children grows up in the shadow of their father, but the shadow is cast at a different angle. And so the descendants echo that all the way through the generations, and it's really interesting to see that happen. I won't go into that in detail. You can ask us all sorts of rude questions about it later. So here's me, and I don't know, this is just me because this is my bit, and I'm covering some sort of broad territory. You're not getting all of it, thank God. We only have 4 or 5 hours. But so, now this is actually a cropped picture from Mim's album. This is Fred and Ida just before they went off to Austria in 1889 at Buck and Fanny's farm in upstate New York, which Mim will tell you more about. I love this image of them because I think of them as really young or old. And here they are sort of in their 30s at a pivotal moment in the career, and they're visiting Buck and Fred were very close as siblings and stayed close their whole lives. And from them, Fred and Ida's children are Ulysses and Julia, the oldest grandchildren of Ulysses and Julia. So there was a certain amount of filial piety in the naming here. So Ulysses S. Grant III, shown in his West Point uniform, and Julia Grant, who, as you can tell from her rather outrage, see, I've actually written about the jewelry she's wearing because that's what I do. Because that still exists, not in the family, tragically, but this is in 1901 when she is Princess Cantacuzene, Countess Speransky, and is one of the famous 3 Amerikanka in Russian noble society. There are 3 American princesses. She is the most notorious because she's quite outspoken. And here, and then our grandfather, Ulysses III, in Mufti, when he meets at the White House working for Teddy Roosevelt, right after his West Point appointment, and I'm sure great-grandfather Fred wheedles and wheedles until Teddy caves in and gives young Ulysses a job right out of West Point. And he meets the daughter of the Secretary of State, Elihu Root, Edith Root, who we all remember as our grandmother. And these are pictures taken around the time of their marriage in 1907 in Washington, D.C. And then I'm not going to go into Julia's family, but this is Julia at the time in 1899 in Newport, Rhode Island, where she's taken under the wing of her Aunt Bertha and is married off to this Russian prince, quite under her own steam, and I've been doing research on that. Because she writes, by the way, if you're interested, she writes books of memoirs 1919, 1920, 1921 about her life and her life in Russia. And it's a very interesting thing to read. And Michael, well, you'll see another picture of Michael, and I won't get into that. So here's my grandparents' wedding picture, which actually hangs by my bedside at home, not to, you can all go, oh. But it's a beautiful picture. And our grandmother was 29 when they married. She was sort of trapped. She was the oldest child, but she was a girl, so she couldn't go to college. She couldn't do what she wanted to do. This is part of my theorizing. But she was 29, and that's really late to get married in 1907. And she meets this dashing, handsome, articulate young man with a great name, but no money, you know, the Grants. And she says, okay, this is a good one. And is there any correspondence about their courtship?
I don't think so.
Because they were a beautiful couple, and they were a very happily married couple for 50-some years. And I'd love to know the backstory. I may make up something about it. Because that's what you do when you don't know. You make it up.
I'm just going to say that our half-sister Marion said that she heard grandmother say once that she felt like she was married to a monument.
Well, that could be taken any one of two ways.
It was as if the Grants took center stage on a whole lot of things.
And so this is a picture that I found in a family album, and Claire may have this, but this is grandfather and grandmother with Edith, Aunt Dee Dee, their mother, raise your hands, and then Eleanor's grandmother, and then Clara Frances, who was always known as Hancy because my mother couldn't pronounce Clara Frances and called her Tara Hancy. So there you go. And there they are, probably in Washington in 1912, which is when Hancy is born. And here's my mother in 1916 with her mother. And I've always wondered, I love this photograph because it's very intimate, but it's very defiant. And I talked to my mother. With the birth of my mother in 1916, the telegrams come pouring in, oh, it's another girl, you must be crushed. And I asked my mother about that. She said, we never, ever felt that we weren't the most beloved children on earth. And this is my grandmother defying everybody, saying, this is my baby girl, Julia, who, by the way, was described as destructive by her mother later on. And grandmother looks like mother. She looks like my mother in that picture. And here are the three girls. This is at grandfather's 80th birthday in the house in upstate New York that they inherited from Elihu Root, that we all knew as children this was about an hour from where I grew up. But this is, so, Hancy, Clara Frances, Julia, and Dee Dee, or Edith, with Edith and Ulysses late in their lives, probably looking through one of their albums from the 1920s. He was military, he was a career Army Corps of Engineers. He built the Parkway to Mount Vernon. He built the Alexandria Memorial Bridge. He engineered it. He built the third floor on the White House for the Coolidges. So his whole career was very much involved with Washington, but I never knew him that way. I'm the baby of a generation, and so I didn't really know him except in upstate New York in this house. And just because I'm in charge. Here's me and my grandfather on his 85th birthday in 1966. And I hated that cake because it had whipped cream frosting, and I was so crushed because I hated whipped cream. So I was smiling, putting on a good front. And just because I'm in charge, we found this in an album of Claire's, and I think this is Princess Kanakazane, Prince Kanakazane, my grandmother, my grandfather, Fred and Ida at the Army-Navy game. And clearly, the prince is thinking, oh, kill me now. And it must have been cold, they're really bundled up. But I love, Claire has a whole album that's devoted to Julia Kanakazane. And these photographs exist nowhere else, as far as I know, and nobody would care about them except us. So, the two lines who are not here, and I wanted to talk about them because we met them and we know them somewhat. This is Julia and her redoubtable father, the Colonel Dent, with Jesse and Nellie. Posed sometime early in the presidency or after the Civil War. This feels like a post-Civil War photograph to me.
Her hairdo is.
Yeah, I mean, her hairdo is that sort of girlish 1860s that really few women can pull off ever. Now, Jesse's eldest son is Chapman, and he was a famous herpetologist, and we can find nothing, not one photograph. There must be something in the family, but we don't know. But Claire went to Escondido, California, and with Nim, and met Ulysses S. Grant V and his wife Jean. So these are virtually the only pictures we have in our family of this side. And California is interesting because there's Southern California, there's a whole U.S. grant thing going on down there. But Mim can talk more about that. And I love that picture because I see something of the grants in U5. We all have these abbreviations. So it's U1, U2, U3, UD, I'm UD. And so, because one does, after all. And then there's son Chapman, who was our generation, a great-great-grandchild who died younger. I mean, he died in his 50s or 60s, who we met. Did you put those signs on them? It looks like they're mug shots. And then these folks who are still out there, U.S. Grant the Sixth, who actually looks rather like the general, and his sister, Alicia, and then U6's daughter, Taylor Madison Grant, who I once dreamed of marrying off to my son, Alexander Ulysses, but that's not going to happen. That family mostly now lives around Springfield, Missouri, as far as we know. And U5 was my mother's generation, and he died 3 or 4 years ago. You taking notes?
No, I just, I looked at her and thought she looks a little like Juliet.
Ooh.
Who looks like Juliet?
Oh, wait a minute, I had Juliet and Margot mixed up.
Oh, wait, me?
Looks, looks sort of like you.
So, and then in 1874, in the White House, at the beginning of Grant's second term, Julia finally got a pile of money from Congress to redo, and I've done a whole book on the White House, and I won't bore you with the decoration of the interiors, but she redid the East Room in order to marry off Nellie to this aristocratic, Nellie whose name was Ellen, but this aristocratic Englishman named Algernon Sartoris, and Algernon cried at his own wedding, and U.S. Grant cried at the wedding because he didn't like Algernon at all and was losing his baby to England. And it's a complicated story, and it didn't go well. But there they are. Henry James writes about Nellie Sartoris after she and Algernon separate, but the Sartoris family keeps her because they don't like him either. And there's a great quote from Henry James, which I should have brought with me. But the Sartoris descendants, so my generation, our generation, from Nellie is Antoine Sartoris and his sister Claude, who was a baroness, and none of us could remember her last name. What? They're French. So all of the descendants, well, you'll get to that in a minute, but Antoine we know quite well, and his wife Josie, and there they are. And this was at the meeting in Galena in the 1990s. St. Louis in the 1990s. And here is the whole clan gathered in France for. Did you go to this, Claire? Is that why you took the picture? No. But so this is their son Xavier and his wife Hélène, who we entertained at the Jersey Shore just before they got married. So this is at their wedding, and this is the whole Sartoris clan.
And that's Jessamine right there.
Jessamine.
Which is Jessamine?
This was the wedding.
In the black dress
Jessamine is there, next to the lady in blue.
Yeah,
Above
black
the
dress.
child.
Black.
Jessamine's holding a glass. That's my daughter, my daughter.
I don't see anybody. Oh, Jessamine's tall.
No,
Oh, her?
Yes.
That's Jessamine. I was looking for a little child. I know Jessamine. I'm not that
Jessamine
crazy.
was there, that was when she was in Egypt and she went up to France for the wedding.
So there they are. And then just because I know Xavier best, he visited us recently. Xavier and his wife Hélène, and this is what I want. So this is their oldest son, Arthur, and their middle son, Ulysses. So this is the youngest Ulysses, and Guillaume, the baby of the family. And notice he's wearing glasses. So he has strabismus, just as Julia did. So there is a family, and he was, and you can cure it with eyeglasses now. But I said, this is a family legacy, so this is...
I have a question. Does Xavier still have a comic book?
Xavier, he runs a...
In the Loire?
He used to run a small chain of comic book stores called the Bazar du Bizarre around Rouen, up in sort of lower Normandy. And, but he now actually, his business is... he manufactures action figures in China. And he was in New York for Comic-Con, which is when he came to visit us. So he's a very interesting man. I'm very fond of Xavier. And so that's that. That's just to give you the big picture. So there are 2 of the lines here. There are 2 other lines out there, and you'll have to go to France. And we're going to work on them. We've got a few years till the bicentennial, and we're going to get some of them here, I'm sure. So now, Dr. Selbren. So I know I call everybody
Can you all
doctor.
hear me? Okay.
This
This is a very
here.
hard act to follow.
You can click. You know how to work this thing?
No. Isn't it working?
No, it is. It is right. That's if you want to go forward, and there's the laser pointer. So just hit,
Pictures.
point it toward something.
And push that, and I'm like, oh.
Yeah, try it.
Yeah.
There you go. So where do I sit?
Right there.
I'll stand
Yeah.
at the podium. Who cares?
Okay.
You're on.
We're going to start at Merriweather Farm at Salem Center, New York. It is a property that my great-grandfather, U2, bought. And there was the family gathered and friends, and it was a really center place. And so my pictures are all centered around this wonderful place. Now, I happened to have a relative give me a book of the pictures of Merriweather Farm. And I looked at it, and it's the reason I think that we are all so close in this generation. It's those pictures and their relationship. And it came to my attention because there were some of us who belonged to beneficiaries of the U.S. Grant Junior Trust, and for 25 years, although the trust lasted longer than that, my cousins came and they often stayed with me. So for 25 years, quarterly, we met in San Diego. We started to talk about why were we so close, because we didn't grow up together. And it finally became apparent that it was because our grandparents were close, and really, really close, and stayed in touch. So it was a way of thinking, but also a way of being with one another that is our heritage. And so these are some pictures that show that closeness. That is the house, Merriweather Farm. And I've heard about Merriweather Farm since I was little, so it's always been a magical place for me. And I love the name Merriweather, it makes me happy. So lots of friends and family came to visit. And this is U2, Julia, Mrs. Grant, Chaffee, Fanny Josephine, as some of us call Mrs. U2, Miriam, my grandmother, and Aunt Totsie, whose name I think was Fanny, the little one.
So that's Miriam.
That's Miriam.
So that's Julia.
That's Julia.
Because that's your
My
name, and
grandmother.
and Totsie was who? She was Fanny?
Yes, I'm pretty sure she was Fanny. So I love this picture. I think it shows them very nicely as a family. And this is the one that Ulysses took the picture of Fred and Ida from, and that's U2 and my grandmother, great-grandmother. And this is, of course, in the front is Chaffee, Miriam, Julia, and in the back, Mrs. Grant, U2, and Mrs. U2. But although these pictures are posed, there's a relationship that seems to show up to me among them that I love very much. Now, neither Ulysses or I know who the man on the left is or the woman in the center behind Buck is.
That could be Fanny.
Oh, I think it is, but I'm not sure. The little girl
And that,
behind
you
is
think that's
Julia.
Jessie?
Yes, that's Jesse. And you can see he's not loved at all. And he didn't love his niece and nephew. So that's Chaffee and Miriam that are sitting on their lap. And this is Mrs. Grant with Chaffee, Julia, and Miriam.
And all the shots of her face on. There's all the myth that no one ever photographed her face on. And she's in her late 60s at this
Yeah,
point?
she looks really nice. And here is Julia, Fred's daughter, right?
Fred's Julia.
Fred's Julia, my grandmother, Miriam, and with any of the pictures that I have of them, they're always together. Whenever Fred's Julia visited, my grandmother was right at her side. And then you three, and Duty and Chaffee. Chaffee was the only boy until the fifth one arrived sometime after this.
And so that was Ulysses the Fourth, who did not have children. and he came later.
Yes, he did.
How much
He was-
younger than?
I don't know. Okay, so this is just, Miriam, Topsy, Fanny, Josephine, Chaffee, and Judy, Julia called Judy. There was a tendency to call everybody by a nickname. I don't know where that started from. And just to show you some of the relative ages of the children, on the right is Miriam, Chaffee, Julia, and Topsy. Now here's the schoolhouse, which was on the grounds, and yes, it was a schoolhouse. And there's Miriam, Chaffee, Julia with their governess. Now, years later, I saw a picture of my U.S. Grant IV, my uncle, great uncle, and he was standing in front of a house, a cottage in La Jolla. And I thought, why is he out there? Because they lived in downtown San Diego. And I came to learn that the nanny started the famous Green Dragon Colony in La Jolla. And so she, like a lot of the people that were associated with the grants, once you were associated, you stayed associated. You didn't get thrown away or they didn't move on. And so my mother was born in that schoolhouse, and here's a picture of my grandmother Miriam, Fanny Josephine, and the little one is my mother Fanny, which I think is very sweet. Now, one of the things that I think is a legacy from the grants is the tenderness with which they treated their children. And I know that that comes from U1 and Julia. And here is U2 with his little tiny daughter, Topsy. And it's just so obvious that he loves her and how comfortable he feels. And I think it's such a wonderful expression of family love.
Very modern photograph in that sense.
Yeah. Now, one of the other things that was apparent is that children and people were accepted for who they were. I remember looking at these pictures as a child and remember thinking, a little boy, it turns out, no, that's Aunt Topsy. And she was obviously a little eccentric and obviously was a little rough and tumble because of the patch on her arm. I just loved her, obviously, and enjoyed her. So here is, again, Julia, Miriam, Uncle Chaffee, and the thing that and he's holding Dorothy, who's a doll I still have. And although he didn't have any boys to play with, it didn't affect his manhood at all. He used to walk about the story I've heard. He'd walk into the room and trip over something fake and fall flat on his face as he entered the room, and everybody'd say, "Oh, are you hurt? Are you hurt?" And he'd get up laughing. No, it was a joke. So, and then the one on the left is the stage, but it looks like they're having such fun at this adventure. And they also went on family forays, which was right on the grounds of Merriweather Farm. There's also a wonderful one, I couldn't find the second picture, where they're sitting around eating watermelon. And then there's a picture of all the empty plates with watermelon rinds on them. So they and this is the one I absolutely love, and I think it bespeaks of the love and the kindness that they had with one another. Buck is on his back, and the girl on the left is Julia. My grandmother is in the middle with Fanny Josephine, Topsy, and Chaffee. And I think that if we could all learn to hang out together like this, that we'd all be better people, as a nation. I think we've forgotten this beautiful thing. That ends it.
Claire's going to mop up, and then we'll open things up.
Moving forward. Which one?
To the right arrow is forward, and then the green laser button at the top.
I have to preface this with saying that I'm in terror when I have to speak in front of groups of people. And somebody at breakfast suggested that might be genetic. So what I've done
Do you
is,
want to come down here so you can see the pictures?
that'd probably be a good idea.
Or stand here. Come and stand here and I'll sit.
Here.
No, she'll have it.
Okay.
So what I've done, so that I don't have to speak in front of people, is there are a few descendants who aren't with us any longer who wrote notes about their childhood and growing up as a descendant. And so I thought I'd just read, it's just just a few paragraphs, it won't be a whole lot. But I thought I would read those, and if you're interested in descendants, the first generation, Jesse wrote a book in the days of my father, General Grant, which is really quite an interesting book because he was an interesting character. And I recommend anybody who's interested in descendants read Jesse's book. Okay. Wrong one. Okay. Now, one thing, I try to think what are the things that are salient in my life as a descendant that maybe I share in common with other descendants. One of them is that I have a lot of relatives named Ulysses and Julia. And we have Julia here and Ulysses here. We have Juliet Selgren. I think the youngest Ulysses now is the French Ulysse. And the youngest Julia, because I got to get this in, the youngest Julia is my granddaughter, who's 8 years old and lives in the Jersey Shore. Now this is my grandfather, U.S. Grant III. And
You have a suit that he's wearing, don't you?
I have a suit, yes. And I think that one of the things that was very hard for my grandfather and very hard for all of us that we share in common is that people, when they found out you were descended from Ulysses S. Grant, it was really obvious with him, you immediately got the fake news and you got very hurtful remarks. Yeah. Oh, he was the drunk. He was the butcher. He was the man who had the scandalous administration. And Ulysses mentioned one time at the tomb, nobody ever looked at you and said, oh, he was the president who advocated for the 15th Amendment. That was passed in his administration. And no one ever said that he was the best thing to happen. He did the best as president for the freed slaves after Abraham Lincoln of any president. Nobody ever said that. Now, Ron Chernow said that. It's on page 858. But when I was young, I didn't know enough to really have a rejoinder when people said these things. And also, I'm not confrontational. But there was a descendant who really did stand up for her ancestor. And this is Julia Grant Dietz, Ulysses' mother. She's sitting with her father, Ulysses III, and that is her grandmother Grant, who is Ida, who was married to Fred. Now, Catherine Graham, the owner of the Washington Post, wrote her autobiography called Personal History. And in it, she has a recollection of going to school with Julia. No, it's this one. Yeah. And she had a recollection, and she said, by the 7th and 8th grades, I had made some other friends, Julia Grant and Madeline Lang, both daughters of Army officers, and Julia, the granddaughter of President Grant. When we studied the Civil War in 6th grade, the students brought in pictures of their relatives who had fought in the war. Rose brought one of her great-grandfather, who was a clergyman in the Confederate Army. Julia came with a famous photograph of General Grant leaning against a tree. Guess why he's leaning up against that tree, Rose cracked. Because he's too drunk to stand up. Julia socked her, knocked her down on the playground. And Rose's mother had to write a note of apology to Mrs. Grant, so the peace was restored. Now, today, I think it's very, very interesting that they apologized to the family of the girl who knocked the other one down. That's not the way it would have gone today. They would have been in court. Now, something else that I think most of us have, and all of us have in common, is what we refer to as Grant stuff. And you've seen some of it here in the library exhibits. There are certain...
No,
Oh, I didn't know you put that in.
I put that in. That's
Oh, that's Catherine Grant and Julia
Yes,
Grant.
that is Catherine.
That's cool.
Oh, I didn't even know that.
Yeah, I found that in Algebra.
Yes, it is.
So if any of you have seen The Post, that's Meryl Streep.
Okay, so the grant stuff, this is that, Ulysses had given a plate like this to the library. I think every single line, all 4 lines, there's rose canton china that's come down to people. Most of the memorabilia of Ulysses S. Grant that was, you know, about his official life as president when he traveled around the world and during the war, most of that went to the Smithsonian Institution because in order to pay back William Vanderbilt for the loan that he wrote to shore up Grant Ward, he signed over all his really important memorabilia gave it to William Vanderbilt. And when William Vanderbilt came back and said, I'm going to put these in trust with Julia Dent Grant as the trustee, and then she will promise to give them to the government, to the federal government, and that's what happened. So what came down was a lot of china and glassware and some personal items, you know, things that were carried in pockets, but mostly the china. But my mother wrote a little memoir that I have in which she talks about going to her grandmother's house and the stuff there. And she said, our grandmother Grant loomed large in our lives. She was a very positive lady, considered a beauty, and in her quiet way was quite domineering. She lived in a tall 4-story house on Massachusetts Avenue, not far from us. Her house was full of furniture, china, pictures, and precious items of family history, many of which are now in our houses. She always had on her living room wall a picture, which I now have of my father, aged 4, that's the one that was up there before, in long golden curls. He was dressed up in a purple velvet suit made from one of his mother's dresses and carried a hoop. This picture always embarrassed my father terribly. Under that portrait, grandmother had a glass case full of uniforms, buttons, epaulets, medals, etc., all from U.S. Grant. And her mantle and shelves were full of gifts and honors received in the family's travels. We were expected to eat lunch with my grandmother every Sunday. I remember the food was wonderful, especially the tomato soup in Meissen soup bowls with great dollops of sour cream. The dining room chairs had USG carved on them, and there was a cabinet of rose canton china monogrammed USG. Now the chairs that had the USG on, I think when we went to Washington, not last time, but before, they were at George Washington University and we saw them there. Another thing that we all share in common is really the greatest gift that we get as descendants, and that is participation in grant organizations and events. Now this is the christening of the SS President Grant in March of 1967, and it took place here in Pascagoula, Mississippi. And that's my mother breaking a bottle of champagne over kissing the ship. Behind her in the dark suit is her older sister Edith, mother, and she had christened in 1963, she'd christened a submarine. The USS, nuclear submarine.
Right.
So, we've all been going to things like this ever since, but we haven't christened ships. But Mother remembered as a child and wrote in this little memoir, Father was in charge of public buildings and parks under Presidents Coolidge and Hoover. Due to his job and our family name, our life included many public and historical occasions. In 1926, Edith and I raised the flags at the new Red Cross building. In 1927, we were at the inauguration of telephone service to Mexico. In 1927, also, we 3 girls went on an overnight trip to Point Pleasant, Ohio, with grandmother, Aunt Julia Canacuzane, and our parents to dedicate the restored cabin where U.S. Grant was born, and to dedicate a memorial bridge nearby across Indian Creek. We were settled in the Hotel Gibson's in Cincinnati and driven from there to Point Pleasant. There we all sat on a platform with various dignitaries and some Civil War veterans, including Lieutenant John Jones, the sole surviving officer of the 21st Illinois Regiment, where U.S. Grant began his Civil War career as its colonel. The old veterans were very jolly and threw candy hearts to us children. Suddenly, the platform broke and collapsed. Fortunately, no one was hurt, but we were all pretty shaken. There were several speeches, one of which was my father's. Ribbons across the bridge were cut, and Julia unveiled a plaque of U.S. Grant on the bridge. We then were driven back to Cincinnati in terrible traffic and collapsed in the hotel. When grandmother got to her room, there seemed to be no bed in it, and she called the desk to tell them that her bed had been taken. The desk clerk thought that she had said that her bag had been taken, so he called the house detective to investigate. It turned out that the room had a Murphy bed that folded into a closet in the wall, and that was a contraption that grandmother had never heard of.
I think that house where Grant was born was put on a barge during his first campaign and taken all over the country to show. And as such, that is no longer considered an historical building because it's been moved.
Well,
But it's been back and it's original.
but you know, there was a
We all went
picture,
there.
there was a picture that Julia, you and John, there was a picture that Julia Dent Grant included in the pictures that she wanted to go in her memoir. And it says on the back, this is the cabin where the wee babe was born, the sun shone over him, who
Who would free 2 million slaves or something.
yes, and yes, he did, she said. And then she said, however, this is not the cabin that we visited when we visited Point Pleasant, New York. And that was what she wrote on the back of the
And
picture.
we
I
have
haven't figured that
You have
out.
to realize that it's not, as we think of, when we say a cabin, it wasn't a log cabin, it was a clapboard covered little tiny one-room house.
Well, it was more
We
of
all,
a
the
cottage,
USGA went
but
there.
there was one other dignitary who was at that dedication ceremony in Princeton, Ohio. I think it was President, okay, who was it, who followed, Woodrow?
Harding.
Was it,
Fellow person.
Harding. Gee.
Yeah, I think it was Warren Harding, who was also there.
Well, apparently Mother didn't notice him.
All right.
Now, so as I said before, I think really the association with these organizations and these events is probably really the best thing that happens to us as descendants. And I remember as a teenager sitting at my mother's table and also at my grandfather's table. And I heard a lot about Dr. Simon. Dr. Simon was revered in my family for the work he did. And the papers, they were so happy about the papers being published because they thought that that would put things to right about the reputation of their grandfather. And that is exactly what's happened. So I also have to say that it's my association with these groups that's taught me about Ulysses S. Grant, because believe me, I really didn't know much of anything. We didn't really talk about that in the family. These children that were born, the grandchildren that were born when he got sick and died, there were only 4 of them, and Julia was probably 8.
9, she was just 9.
And our grandfather was 4, and Miriam was born, and Nell, Jesse's daughter Nell. But those children didn't really know their grandfather. My grandfather wrote in his book, Ulysses S. Grant, Warrior and Statesman, he wrote that he and his mother and father lived in the house in New York with U1 and Julia Dent Grant. And when he got sick, he remembered that his grandfather was in bed and that he was in a wrapper all the time, but that he could get up and go and stand at the window and watch troops marching down. Now, they could see Fifth Avenue from that house. So there must have been a parade or something. So this little 4-year-old remembers that. And then other than that, he remembers they never told them what the illness was or what was going on, but they were told that they had to be very quiet and not run about, and that they must not speak to any newspaper people. We followed these grandchildren everywhere. I mean, we have scrapbooks of newspaper articles about this little boy. Like they must have been really followed by the paparazzi constantly. So anyway, I just want to say thank you, all of you, for teaching us about it. Thank you for bringing all of us together so we know each other now. Thank you for really, this library is overwhelming, what we've seen here today. And thank you for everything you've done to restore U1's reputation and to restore his legacy.
Someone has to, oh, this.
That's the whole motley crew, and that includes all 4 lines. The Jesse people are there, the French Sartoris is there, and the star of this trip was right here, Dr. Eleanor Price. That's it, right? That's it.
I heard about that at the end.
Randy's holding on to you. You're next to me.
High-State Fairgrounds. In a structure, the hump was displayed, the birthday was displayed at the High-State Fairgrounds for a significant period of time.
Yeah.
And a special building of some kind where thousands of people could, see it, because that was a popular place to go, the High-State
And
Fair.
of course, the same thing happened with the log house hardscrabble, that it has been moved by the Bush people to Bush Farm, but it was in a totally different location now in the St. Louis County when it was built.
The other thing they said was when when that mobile home was out and about, Civil War veterans would flock to Point Pleasant just to look at the spot.
The
for
foundation.
Yeah, the birthplace.
So,
And one of the things, another thing I was thinking of with that picture of grandfather when he was a little girl, in his purple velvet suit with the lace collar and the long curls. He was 4 at the time. Well, and you'll see pictures of the Grant family on the steps of Mount McGregor when U.S. Grant I was dying. He's the one with a straw hat and with the bangs and the long curls. Well, his grandmother, Julia Dent Grant, at some point soon after that, had somebody cut his hair so he did not have long curls anymore. And his mother was absolutely horrified. She was so resentful of her mother-in-law for having done that. And our grandfather, of course, felt very proud to finally have a boy's haircut. He loved his grandmother because she would do things like that.
I'd like to say something about my grandmother, if it's okay. Julia Dent Grant, and she was a very quiet woman, but she had definite ideas of her own. We'd get all ready to go to dinner as a family, and she'd say, I don't want to go now. We're going to go walk around and look at the roses in the garden. But she changed her mind a lot. She was the little girl with the long curls. Very beautiful. And what I see in my line is the love of animals. We have a love of animals in our family. And one time she was at a picnic in Yosemite, And she just disappeared, and her mother later said, well, where did you go? Oh, I didn't tell you, I went off for 3 hours riding with the Indians. She had a horse, and she just went off with the Indians, and I didn't hear, I was really wondering what happened, you know. I didn't hear any more about that story, but my cousin, who's not here today, Julia, she is called the Horse Whisperer in Oregon, and she can break and tame wild mustangs. So it's very interesting, and I went with her once, and I said, where are we going? And she said, oh, well, the guy said that I could come because I'm the only one that can, the horses will come to me. And we went out in this huge valley, and we had binoculars, and there were about 30 wild mustangs, and they literally, 2 of them came over right up to us. So there's a magic with the animals in our family, and I don't know about the other relatives, but I find that kind of fun.
You want to say something, Eleanor? Or, I mean, I want to give, I know our time is, I'm looking at John over there. But, so Eleanor is the representative for the three great generation. Has it been?
It's really nice. You know, being part of this family, you're very spoiled because there are all of these people who research your family for you. And there is all of this family history. And I was telling some folks already that you get to have this sense of, you know, history and attachment to the United States, and also connection. So, you know, I'm a family medicine physician, and my medical assistant, after we'd already been working with each other for a few years, I found out that her great uncle was Mark Twain. And so, you know, we've got, you know, okay, our relatives, we're buddies. Like, that's so cool. And the effect that each of our lines has had on the success of the other is just really cool. Because a lot of people don't have that. You know, a lot of people don't know anything about their grandparents, much less their great-grandparents. And I'm far enough removed from it that, you know, I never met y'all's grandfather. And so it does start to kind of, or it could be fading towards legend, but there are a lot of people who are keeping it alive and, you know, keeping the facts alive because, you know, they're family stories. And then I'll mention them, and people who actually know their stuff will be like, no, let me tell you about what really happened with your ancestor. You know, like, that might be what you say in your family, but here's the facts that we found. Yeah. And the story about the punching incident always gave me strength because growing up, you know, I'm younger, but I still get the, oh, you're related to Grant? Oh, that drunk. You know, oh yeah, and from young people too, like from elementary school on up. And then I married somebody from here in Starkville, and on our first date, the first thing I had to make sure was that he wasn't a Confederate. And so, you know, I asked him something along those lines, like at the beginning of our conversation, and he was like, no, actually my dad had been friends with John Barzilak, you know, going back 20 years, and so we knew it was meant to be.
I wanted to, I didn't get to say this, but I'm so honored to be here. I know all of us are. We're a little overwhelmed with the library. It's just so amazing what you've done and your peers. They had a vision, and I'm sure they worked very, very hard to put this together. And I'm a little emotional, but to walk into that library and see my great-great-grandfather and just see he's honored today in the South, no less, is quite moving. It's quite moving because there's a lot of healing going on, especially with current political things. But I've got a funny little story, and then I'm done. I was told this by I think it was my mother, and she said, you know, she said our great-great-grandmother wasn't vain at all. I mean, she had these great parties and stuff, but as far as her appearance, you know, she was just who she was, a very down-to-earth woman, except when she found out that Grant was nominated for president and could very well win, she didn't tell him, and she went into a hospital she was going to get her crossed eyes set so they'd see directly, you know. and she didn't tell him. And somehow he found out about this, and he dashed over to the hospital before they gave her some probably weird anesthetic back then. And he said, no, if she changes her eyes, I won't know who I'm kissing. And he said, well, back then those operations, were very dangerous. And he said, no, I refuse. I married you this way. I fell in love with you this way, and you will be this way. And that's an old family story.
So, any intrusive questions you'd like to ask? Well, John, you want to sit here? You got to speak.
Okay. I would just like to mention something. I am a Civil War reenactor, and I portray a Yankee staff officer, which means I get to sit down. Anyhow, I go to all these events, and I invariably end up talking about my great-great-grandfather. And people are always asking, how are you descended from him? And I go into great detail. And every so often there's some total stranger who comes up and says, I'm descended from Grant. And I said, oh, okay, how? And so, which of his 4 children are you descended from? And verbally they say, I don't know. So, anyhow, I invite them to check up on him. And so far, no one's gotten back to me, but it's always kind of interesting. Yeah, and well, I deal with people from both sides, and so I guess you would say Civil War reenactors are a special group. And basically they all associate with each other and have a great time. Yeah.
I loved, there's a YouTube video of someone from a church talking to John at one of these events, and it's just the funniest thing because they treat him like he is a museum piece himself. His gentleman gets down crouching next to where John is sitting and says, what is it like? And it's just, it's the funniest thing. Museum piece, medical museum piece.
So, we all have family stories that have been passed down through generations. Have you, any of you, encountered a story that's been passed down, which you later found out really wasn't true?
Yeah.
I think the fun one is the whole story of why they didn't go to the Ford Theater on the critical night. Because the version that I have heard generations down was that it was like a supernatural premonition of Julius, and then everyone else was like, no, she just didn't like Mary Todd Lincoln. Like it was nonsense.
Mary Lincoln didn't like her, but it was also, they really wanted, the Civil War was over, and they wanted to go up and see their children. They wanted to hop on a train and go see Fred and Ulysses and Nellie who were at school up near Philadelphia, 2 different places. And they got on the train and started off, and then of course they found out that the president had been shot and got on the next train and went back to Washington. So,
Well, I also think that, of course, and this is done so beautifully in the library. Have you seen the interactive where you press a button and then it asks questions about Grant? Was he a drunk? Was he? And when I read Ron Chernow book, it really portrayed that he hated the war. He missed his family terribly. And so that old adage about that he was a drunk and that he was coarse and all this stuff, that's the first question I get asked. As soon as somebody finds out I'm a descendant, they go, well, what do you think about the drinking? And Ron portrayed it so well. He's the only biographer, I think, that did this, that showed that Grant went to many temperance meetings. He conquered drinking in his life, and that was a big deal. And he was a very kind and modest man. And I wrote a couple of qualities that I think are pretty cool. He was very thorough. He had stick-to-itiveness. He had very high ideals. He was a very calm man in a crisis and very gentle. So these other adjectives about him, you know, I've learned to be very calm because I can't, if I got $1 for every time somebody said, oh, well, he's the drinker, I just go, hey, wait a minute here. You're talking to a descendant. But, so if you read Ron Chernow's book, he portrays him, I think, very, very realistically, and he brings out a lot of facts that are not known. So, thank you.
I would say that's one legacy feature is stubbornness. I would say that that's a strong trait in family.
Never. We need to wrap it up, and I will say, you may have gathered this, that the family likes Ron Chernow's book a lot. So if you have issues with it, so be it. And I emailed John the day I finished the book, Ron, and I said, you are officially my best friend. Because that book, you know, as Claire said, none of us, John probably, but none of us really knew any of this until you all forced us to read these books. And I remember the first time I went to Washington with John Y. Simon, and so one of you came up to me and said, so which U.S. Grant books have you read this year? And I thought, what? And the rest is history. So we need to end this now, and I'm putting out a call for the other U.S. Grant descendants in the crowd, and I can see 2 of you need to come up here, and 2 more of you to come up here, and we're going to get a group shot. And if anybody's lurking in the back that I missed, thank you all.
Just all the